Welcome back to the Collective Shift channel. Today, we'll be discussing a recent post by our senior research analyst, Nick, on the state of the metaverse. This is part 2 of a 2-part series in which Nick explores where the metaverse is at in terms of the blockchain-based metaverse ecosystem. For those of you who didn't watch last week's episode, I encourage you to see our analysis of part 1. But in part 2, we'll be getting into ways to get exposure to the metaverse sector. This post was published for Collective Shift members recently, and is an example of the type of content we produce for our valued members to help them save time and make informed decisions. Nick, I'll hand over to you to take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Enjoyed our first chat talking about the metaverse. So the first post mostly looked at where we are right now in the metaverse and going over some sort of explanations and challenges that I think a lot of businesses are going through. And now part 2 really dove right into different ways to get exposure. So one of my main takeaways from the post pretty much was just that I'm pretty bearish on quite a lot of these metaverse projects. Members have access to sort of an Airtable where I rate and categorize a lot of these cryptocurrency projects in terms of their token, how much land they have, what their use is, and where they fit in the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that Airtable is very well put together, Nick. And yeah, it's going to be updated throughout the year, I'm sure, as a lot more of these projects go live. But yeah, I know that the sort of overall, way that you approach part 2, I know was, ways to gain exposure. I think for people who watched our sort of video on the state of gaming, in January and February, you know that this was a similar sort of, part 2 to ways to get exposure to gaming. With respect to, the metaverse sector, Nick, talk a bit about how you broke down the ways that, investors out there can get exposure to the metaverse sector.
So just looking at, I guess, some other metaverse indexes and sort of products out there, looking just from a purely, informational perspective in terms of one of the biggest ones, which is the Bitwise Metaverse Index, which looks at and splits it up into sort of 4 areas. It goes asset ledgers and these different interoperability solutions, which come together. So they're kind of the core infrastructure that allow it to happen. And then we've got other infrastructure tools such as things like Arweave or Chainlink, which power a lot of this Web3. Then we can split that up into decentralized finance and marketplaces, and then these virtual platforms and communities, which are more akin to your Sandbox or your ApeCoin. That was a really interesting one that I thought is a good representation of how different people are looking at getting exposure. Then we can sort of break that up into 5 different ways, which we can dive into is metaverse tokens, which is probably the most popular way people will think to get exposure to metaverse. Then we have crypto native infrastructure, which is just things like, as I mentioned, the Graph. Then we got Chainlink and Arweave. Then we got crypto indexes, all the way down to the NFTs in the metaverse, such as items and lands. And then we even have the non-crypto route, which I personally feel is probably the highest probability of getting broad exposure to this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, thanks for breaking that down, Nick. I like how you started it native to crypto and then all the way through to ways that are exogenous to crypto to really give everyone an option out there. I noticed throughout your part 2 of your report, you kind of, as I'm getting up on my screen here, you kind of I like the way you categorize it in terms of the time management in terms and also like level of knowledge required. I think because that's one thing our members, the Collective Shift community, are always sort of telling us they don't have time. How do I get involved in XYZ without using up hours and hours of my spare time? So I really like how you categorize this. I think, could you talk a bit about which ones were sort of the most time intensive and then also which ones were sort of required the most level of knowledge and even the least amount of knowledge?
So the ones that really dedicate the most time management and level of knowledge is diving into the metaverse tokens themselves, because after all, if you're going to really research and understand these different platforms, if say one may not perform well, it'll probably go to 0 and then you don't have any broad exposure to the metaverse really. You're putting all your eggs in one basket in terms of looking into whether it's Decentraland or it's Sandbox or whether it's ApeCoin. So right up there as well is looking at NFTs in the metaverse, because you really got to look at like items. These are your sort of profile pictures or your avatars, and then the in-game land themselves, which I've discussed before. I find extremely risky and probably has the highest amount of trust and speculation in the market. In terms of looking at the ones with lowest, is you have to go to your crypto indexes, which provide you the easiest ability, especially if they are rebalanced. You don't have to really worry about putting all your eggs in one basket or keeping up with the latest trends.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just jump in there. So I suppose what you're saying, Nick, is, with a higher risk or higher demand on your time would be the ones that are a more, a really precise play, like such as something like, for just the sake of an example, like the ape token or ape coin token. There might be an instance where in decades to come, you've invested in that, the performance of it may actually go like terribly. And however, like as a sector, metaverses may actually outperform the market and go on to, to greater heights. So I suppose that's the risk you're trying to highlight there, Nick, which I really like how you put it. And then similarly, with the NFTs themselves as well, you might be accurate in terms of your category sort of, hunch that you have that metaverses are going to do well. But yeah, really important note that you kind of outlined there, Nick. So then in terms of the broader exposure, if you are just confident on metaverses, but you really don't want to sort of choose a particular project, could you just talk through, these indexes in a bit more detail as I get it up on screen here?
Yeah, so we have two different ways. I think there's an accredited route, which really depends on your status, I guess, as in your own country, which is really dependent on like your laws in where you reside. So the one that anybody can really access is the Metaverse Index, which is on Uniswap. Then you might have more higher barriers to entry with things like Bitwise's or Multicoin's Metaverse Index. But it's useful to have a look at what they're doing, and you can sort of see the broad exposure that they're looking at, especially Bitwise's Metaverse Index, which really takes into account a lot of broader, quote unquote, like Web3 different protocols in the crypto space. So it's not just down to these big games. They're really expanding the focus. The biggest focus as well, I thought, was this non-crypto route, which was my main takeaway from the post, mainly because I was pretty bearish on a lot of these cryptocurrency metaverses. I'm quite skeptical of a majority of them.
Sure.
And I really have a hunch that a lot of the value will lie with non-crypto plumbing who are powering a metaverse.
So you're talking about things here, like, so things that would enable it to support auxiliary sort of services, like things like chips, like hardware chips and whatnot.
Yes. So a classic example, maybe we could put it on the screen as well, is things like Sandbox. So the Sandbox is a cryptocurrency metaverse and gaming platform and community. But for the Sandbox to become a reality and actually have a product, you need to have in-game engines such as Unity, which render and bring the virtual world to life. Then you need, chip companies like some of the biggest Intel or AMD or NVIDIA to power the graphics to make that happen. Then you even have other sort of in-game virtual creators that come in and populate the metaverse and provide entertainment in these. Then you could go a step further and say the hardware manufacturers that allow you to view it in VR, for example. All these need to happen to power Sandbox to become like a thriving metaverse. So the question really lies whether Sandbox is going to retain the value or whether it's all these, which I like to call the plumbing of the metaverse, which really make it a reality.
Yeah, that's a really great observation. And then in that sense too, you do have, the more comfortable, traditional route of valuing companies and traditional investing that like there is so much like less, novelty to it in terms of when you're trying to pick, whether to pick Decentraland or the Sandbox's native token and all the different things like token unlocks and, inflation, issuance and all that, which traditional investors don't have to worry about per se. So yeah, no, they're really well put. I think, just tying it together now that, you've done part 2 of your 2-part series, we might just leave the listeners here with just my question to you, Nick, overall would be, what's something you really just want to see from like this whole metaverse category in 2023? If you sort of just had to sum up the way you're just feeling about the category as we talk here in early March.
I think it's just continuing to see user activity, especially in the crypto native metaverse. Decentraland has been very guilty of this, that they just haven't been able to retain or access users. So I'd like to say more practical ways to get people involved, make building in these platforms easier, maybe reduce the barriers to entry to creating them, and just really opening it up in a much easier way. I know a lot of these Web 2 ones have gained significant attraction, but crypto native metaverses have really yet to make any impact at all. So really keen to see some more practical uses and use cases come out that make these actually a thing people want to use.
Yeah, no, it's going to be exciting to watch. I know, as we've talked about, there's a lot that are coming online pretty soon, or at least working on significant updates as well for the ones that do exist. So yeah, we'll be tracking that, the Collective Shift team for sure. And discussing it with the community, posting about it in posts such as this one. So yeah, we will wrap things up there. As I did say at the top of the show, this post was published recently on the Collective Shift platform. And yeah, just showcasing here an example of the type of content that we do produce for our valued members to help them save time and make informed decisions. If you are wanting to level up your crypto game, go over to collectiveshift.io to book a free strategy call over at our website. Once again, that's collectiveshift.io. Thanks for joining me, Nick, and thank you all for listening.